Hello, this is the penultimate lesson in the Crime and Deviance scheme of work. This lesson is on human rights and state crime. So if you're watching this video, then you'll be doing this by yourself, presumably. But I just want you to have a little think and some ideas about what the term human rights means to you. What rights do you think all humans should have? Okay, now arguably this is a subjective thing, okay, but we do have a kind of maybe a shared set of values about this. So just jot down some ideas of what you believe human rights mean to you and what rights they should be. So human rights as a definition are a right which is believed to belong to every human person, obviously. Okay, we have a human rights bill which is protects our human rights in the UK, and these include the right to life, freedom from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment, freedom from slavery or forced labour, the right to liberty and security, a right to a fair trial, no punishment without law or legal proceedings, respect for private and family life, home and our own correspondence, freedom of thought, belief and religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, bringing people together, right to marry and to start a family, protection from discrimination in respect of these rights and freedoms, right to peaceful enjoyment of your own property, the right to education, the right to participate in free elections, and the abolition of the death penalty. So have a look at your own list and whether you agree with these rights or not. And then think about this next question. What is state crime? And can you think of any examples of state crimes? Well, a state crime is a crime committed by or on behalf of state agencies. For example, war crimes, genocide, torture, imprisonment without trial, assassination. Okay, and unfortunately we've seen this in too many cases over the past few decades. Ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, whereby over 8,500 Kosovan Albanians and nearly 1,800 ethnic Serbs, 447 civilians of other ethnicities, which would include Romani people and Bosniaks, were murdered by state instruments. State crimes are considered to be the most serious form of crime, and this is for two main reasons. So let's take a deeper look at state crimes. First of all, the reason why they're considered to be so serious is obviously because of the scale of the state crime. In other words, the enormous power of a state gives it the potential to inflict harm on a huge scale. So if we think about an individual, at the moment the highest number of deaths considered by a single person was Gamil al-Batoui, a pilot who crashed the Egypt Air Flight 990, killing 216 passengers. By contrast, the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people instantly. And obviously there were far more people that were affected afterwards, okay, in the name of war. However, for example, in Cambodia between 1975 and 78, the Khmer Rouge government killed up to 1/5 of the country's entire population, up to 2 million people. So even an act of war or an individual is ultimately dwarfed by the acts of the state if it decides that it wants to act criminally. Great power and great crimes are inseparable. Economic and political elites can bring death, disease and loss to tens of thousands with a single decision. Okay, very powerful words, just illustrating the responsibility and almighty power we give to those in charge and how it can be misused. So it's not only the scale that makes state crimes amongst the worst or most horrific, but also the fact that the state itself is the source of law. In other words, the state makes the law so it can avoid defining its own actions as criminal. For example, the Nazi regime creates laws permitting it to sterilise disabled people against their will. okay, whilst Hitler was in power. But of course, they suddenly make that the law, that act of that atrocity, okay, it became written into law, making it justifiable for the Nazis to do this. McLaughlin in 2001 states that there are actually 4 types of state crime. Political crimes, which involves corruption and censorship. Crimes of security, crimes by security forces and police, which can often also be genocide and mass killings. We have economic crimes, which are official violations of health and safety laws. And then you've got social and cultural crimes, which might involve institutional racism or discrimination against certain groups within a society. So what I'd like you to do is to prepare a handout for your classmates. Now, you're not going to do this in groups, obviously, as you're doing this through the video, but I want you to look at a case study on the right here. The genocide in Rwanda, ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, state and corporate crimes, war crimes, or specifically British war crimes. And I want you to include the following things on your handout. I want you to include the types of crimes committed, who the key players or organisations were, and details of the crime. What did they do? I want you to look into the victims as well. Who was it being done to? Who were the victims? Was it across the entirety of society, which is rare, or was it a specific group that was targeted? What was the punishment for the state crime? What was the fallout from this, the resulting consequences? How was this crime represented in the media? Can you provide statistics and supportive data from reliable places? And this is an opportunity to use images or video links for further reading. And I'd like you to complete this on a Sway document for us, please, so that this is usable for other students as a resource, as a revision resource as well. So pick one of those 5 on the right-hand side there, the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s, the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo around the same time, the state or corporate crimes, war crimes, or specifically British war crimes. Okay, and there's your criteria on the left. And you can stick the link to your Sway in the Edpuzzle. Okay, if we look at defining state crime, we need to look at things like domestic law. Because the state defines what is and what is not a crime, we need much more specific definitions to help us understand the true nature and scale of state crimes. Sociologists have put forward several definitions, one of which is domestic law. Okay, so this idea is from Chambliss in 1989. This is acts defined by law as criminal and committed by state officials in pursuit of their jobs as state representatives. Okay, so this is when perhaps people break the law, but it's the defence is that it was part of their job or part of their role, or that they were doing it because of their role. Okay, so if we think about when Dominic Cummings broke lockdown laws, okay, during the lockdown 5 years ago, and what his excuses were for that. Of course, states have the power to make laws, and so they can avoid criminalising their own actions. Okay, so during Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, when lockdown breaches were made, he was accused of changing the rules so that he could avoid any kind of sanctions. In addition to this, they can make laws that actually allow them to carry out harmful acts. As we mentioned before, the Nazi Party, whilst in power in Germany, was able to write laws that enabled their persecution of different social groups. In addition, and we have to think about this, especially after our sessions on globalization, the same act may be illegal in one country, but not another. So there is not necessarily a parity across different countries, which is why we refer to it as being domestic law. Then there is social harms and semiology, a term you might remember from when we were studying green crime. Social harms are defined by Michalowski as state crime is including both illegal acts and legally permissible acts whose consequences are similar to those of illegal acts in the harm that they cause. Hilliard in 2004 argues that we should replace the study of crimes with semiology, which is the study of harms, whether they're legal or not. A semiological approach prevents states from ruling themselves out of court by making laws that allow them to cause harm. So if we go back to green crimes, this is quite an interesting one here. The idea that people, that this is something that, for example, politicians or members of the state can avoid sanctions again because they make laws that allow them to continue or to cause harm within a society. In January 2023, Conservative MPs amended the law to allow water treatment companies to dump sewage in formerly protected waterways, coastlines, rivers and streams. So they're continuing to cause harm, but if you like, sort of changing the law to suit their own needs in this instance. However, critics argue that what constitutes harm is also potentially very vague and too subjective. For example, would these be considered as state crimes? Okay, does allowing homelessness to exist, okay, is clearly harmful, but would we call it a state crime if there are homeless people living on the streets? What about queues? And we've seen news stories of people in beds in NHS hospitals waiting to be treated. Some tragic instances where people actually die waiting to be seen. Should that be considered a state crime, or is that just a reality of an overworked NHS system? Should there be, should states be held accountable if people don't have that kind of right to safety or food in their own homes because of growing pressures economically? So if we look at this on a more international basis, okay, rather than domestic, some laws are created through treaties and arguments between states, such as the Geneva Convention on War Crimes. Roth and Millens in 2008 define a state crime as any action by or on behalf of a state which violates international law and or the state's own domestic law. So if international law is broken, Roth and Millens would consider this to be a state crime as well. A strength, obviously, of this idea is that it uses globally agreed definitions of state crime and international law, so you avoid the issues we had with domestic law. It also has the advantage of being internationally designed to deal with state crimes. And obviously, as we enter a more globalised world, then that makes more sense for predicting how crime will evolve over the future. However, international law is a social construction involving the use of power itself. Strand and Tuman in 2012 found that Japan has sought to overturn the international ban on whaling, which it can often fall foul of or be accused of, by bribing 6 small Caribbean island nations to vote against the ban. So it can seem that international law itself, whilst a global affair, can also be manipulated. And of course, in addition to this, international law largely focuses on war crimes and crimes against humanity rather than other crimes such as corruption. Okay, there's a lot here. As long as you've understood everything, we can move forward. If you have any questions, just pop them into the box below. Moving back to human rights then, let's have a quick recap of what we said at the start of this session. Human rights is a right believed to belong to every person. For example, a breach of human rights would be obviously torture and abuse of prisoners, which we saw in Abu Ghraib prison a couple of decades ago by US soldiers. But also the enlistment of child soldiers, Uganda's anti-gay bill, which can sentence people sometimes to death for their sexuality. Of course, we know that even in UK and westernised countries that child labour was used extensively during the Industrial Revolution. And it goes without saying that the transatlantic slave trade robbed generations of people from their human rights. And the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish people were killed in concentration camps throughout the time of the Nazi rule and during the Second World War. So human rights would include the following: natural rights, so that right to life, to be alive, to have liberty and freedom, and of course to enjoy freedom of speech and expression. Then there are what we would describe civil rights, that right to vote, to a fair trial, the things that we would expect within our society. And the idea is that these human rights and civil rights will protect individuals from the power of the state, meaning that the state shouldn't have more power or the power to harm individuals. Let's keep thinking about this idea of natural and civil rights. Critical criminologists, for example, Herman and Schwendingen, argue that crime should be defined in terms of the violation of human rights rather than breaking legal rules. That should be the first consideration. What this means is that the states that deny individuals human rights must be regarded as criminal. Therefore, states that practice racism, sexism, or inflict economic exploitation on their citizens are actually committing crimes. The sociologist's role in all this should be to defend human rights, if necessary, against the state and its laws if they are discriminatory. So in this respect, their view is an example of transgressive criminology, since it oversteps the traditional boundaries of criminology that are defined by criminal law. However, Cohen argues that some acts, such as genocide, are clearly criminal. However, just because some states act may be seen as morally unacceptable, such as economic exploitation, that doesn't necessarily make it a crime. Other critics claim that it's difficult to arrive at a consensus about what constitutes an actual human right. For example, let's finish some of these ideas with a discussion. Is freedom from hunger an actual human right? Green and Ward in 2012 argue that liberty or freedom is not much use if people are too malnourished to exercise it. Therefore, if the state knowingly permits the export of food from a famine area, this is a denial of a human right, and therefore it's a state crime. The British government did this very thing during the Irish famine in the 1840s, and 1 million people died. So states can act in ways that ultimately might not be considered initially a crime, but will lead to the impact of one. Cohen's claims that the issue of human rights and state crimes is becoming more central to political debate and criminology because of the growing impact of human rights organisations such as Amnesty International and, of course, the increased focus within criminology on victims. So the question we must consider is, why and how do large numbers of normally law-abiding citizens become involved in atrocities? Okay, well, that finishes the session, okay? Something to think about, a lot of kind of moral questions there. There are a couple of activities in the back of your booklets for consolidation, okay? And as always, if you have any more questions, let me know, okay? Thanks very much. Bye-bye.